August 1974. The ground shakes. Across the lawns of a Tudor manor house, 120,000 people surge toward makeshift stages. The Allman Brothers blast through amplifiers that tower like siege weapons. Beer bottles glint in the grass. Smoke rises from campfires. This is Knebworth, and for 3 days, a 500-year-old aristocratic estate has become the biggest rock festival Britain has ever seen. Inside the house, behind leaded windows and oak-paneled walls, the family watches. They needed this. Desperately. The roof is failing. The heating system is medieval. Death duties after the war nearly broke them. Opening the gardens to screaming rock fans wasn't the plan. It was survival. But here's what the crowd doesn't know. This house has always run on compromise, on deals made in desperation, on the gap between the facade and what it takes to keep standing. The rock concerts are just the latest chapter. This is Knebworth House, 5 centuries of English history, one family clinging to legacy, and a truth that cuts deeper than any power chord. This is the twisted truth of Britain's rock and roll palace. This is the story of Knebworth House. It stands in Hertfordshire, roughly 30 miles north of London, a journey that in earlier centuries meant hours by coach and now takes less than one. The house you see today, golden stone, ornate turrets, Gothic spires climbing skyward, looks medieval. It feels like something from a fairy tale or a period drama. Visitors assume it has stood this way for half a millennium. They're wrong. Knebworth has been rebuilt, remodeled, and reimagined so many times that almost nothing of the original Tudor structure remains visible. What looks ancient is often Victorian invention. What seems permanent has been constantly negotiated. The house is a palimpsest, each generation writing over the last, and the story beneath is darker and stranger than the Gothic fantasy suggests. The Lytton family has held this land since 1490. That's more than 500 years of unbroken lineage, a feat almost unthinkable in a country that has seen civil wars, revolutions, plagues, and 2 world wars. But survival came at a cost. To keep Knebworth, the Lyttons sold land, married for money, wrote best-selling novels, and eventually opened their home to paying crowds and rock bands. Behind the turrets and the manicured gardens lies a harder truth. Grand houses don't just stand, they consume. They eat money, labor, and compromise. They demand constant feeding, and when the money runs out, they demand reinvention. The tour guides will tell you about the Victorian remodeling. They'll mention the rock concerts, the filming locations, the famous guests. What they won't tell you is how close this place came to collapse. How many times desperation shaped decisions. How the beauty you see was built and rebuilt by people whose names are lost. This is the twisted truth of Knebworth House. A story about survival, about the gap between image and reality, and about what it really costs to keep a dream alive when the world no longer wants to pay for it. The story begins in 1490, when Sir Robert Lytton, a successful lawyer and courtier, purchased the manor of Knebworth from the crown. England was emerging from the Wars of the Roses. The Tudor dynasty was new and fragile. Buying land wasn't just investment, it was a declaration. It said, "We are no longer merchants or lawyers scrambling for favor. We are gentry. We belong." The original house was modest by later standards. Red brick, timber frames, a great hall for receiving guests and conducting estate business. But even this required enormous capital. Stone and brick had to be hauled by cart from distant quarries. Timber came from managed woodlands. Skilled masons, carpenters, and glaziers commanded wages that dwarfed what common laborers earned. The workforce needed feeding and housing. Every beam raised, every window set, every fireplace built represented accumulated wealth extracted from somewhere else, rents from tenant farmers, fees from legal work, favors traded at court. The construction process was slow and methodical. Unlike modern building where steel frames rise in weeks, Tudor construction moved at the pace of human muscle and animal labor. Oak beams had to be hand-hewn, joints carved with precision, timbers raised using ropes and pulleys. Brickmaking happened on site, clay dug from local pits, formed in wooden molds, fired in temporary kilns. The process employed dozens of men for months at a time. The Great Hall was the centerpiece, rising 2 stories with an open timber roof. This was where Sir Robert would receive tenants, conduct manor court, and host visiting gentry. The message was carefully calibrated, prosperous enough to command respect, traditional enough to claim belonging. The hall's proportions were generous but not ostentatious. The Lyttons were new to land ownership. Excess would invite suspicion. Beyond the hall, the house contained private chambers for the family, service rooms, kitchens with massive fireplaces, storage for grain and ale. The layout followed established patterns, refined over centuries of English domestic architecture. Nothing radical, nothing experimental. The goal was permanence, the appearance of having always been here. The estate itself comprised several thousand acres. Tenant farmers worked the land, paying rents in cash and kind. They owed labor as well, days of work on the manor's own fields, repairs to roads and fences. This feudal arrangement was already old-fashioned by 1490, but it persisted in rural England for centuries more. The tenants lived in cottages that belonged to the estate. They could be evicted if rents went unpaid or if the land was needed for other purposes. The relationship was reciprocal only in theory. The Lyttons provided protection, access to mills and markets, justice through the manor court. The tenants provided labor and rent, but the power imbalance was absolute. The house stood as physical proof of that imbalance, brick and timber announcing who commanded and who obeyed. By the early 19th century, the Lytton family had merged with the Bulwers, creating the Bulwer-Lytton line. The most famous of this generation was Edward Bulwer-Lytton, born in 1803. He was a novelist, a playwright, a member of Parliament, and eventually a peer. His books, The Last Days of Pompeii, Paul Clifford, which opens with "It was a dark and stormy night," sold in huge numbers. He was a celebrity, a public intellectual, a man whose name appeared in newspapers weekly. He was also financially reckless, emotionally volatile, and trapped in a disastrous marriage. His wife, Rosina, was a novelist herself, brilliant and furious. When Edward left her, she pursued him with published attacks, public scenes, and threats. At one point, he had her committed to an asylum. She got out and escalated. The scandal was vicious, public, and expensive. Edward poured money into Knebworth, remodeling it in the Gothic revival style fashionable among Victorian romantics. He added towers, battlements, gargoyles, heraldic decorations. The house became a stage set for his literary persona. But the bills piled up. The estate was mortgaged. Repairs were deferred. When Edward died in 1873, his son Robert inherited a house that looked magnificent and a financial situation that was quietly catastrophic. Edward's literary success was genuine. His novels sold internationally, translated into multiple languages, adapted for the stage. The income was substantial by middle-class standards. But maintaining Knebworth and living as a Victorian gentleman required far more than book royalties could provide. Edward borrowed against the estate's future income, a dangerous gamble that assumed rents would remain stable and his literary reputation would never fade. His political career consumed time and money. Parliamentary seats in the 19th century often required significant personal expenditure maintaining a London residence, entertaining constituents, funding campaigns. Edward served as a Member of Parliament for multiple terms, and later as Secretary of State for the colonies. The positions brought prestige but drained resources. The marriage to Rosina became a public nightmare. She wrote novels that barely disguised her contempt for Edward, portraying him as a villain in fiction after he became one in her life. She disrupted his political events, published pamphlets attacking his character, and refused every attempt at reconciliation. When Edward had her committed to an asylum in 1858, the backlash was severe. The public saw a powerful man silencing an inconvenient woman. Rosina was released after public outcry, and the scandal damaged Edward's reputation permanently. Through all this, Knebworth absorbed the chaos. Edward retreated there to write, to rebuild, to hide from London scandals. The house became both refuge and burden, a symbol of literary success and aristocratic aspiration that he could neither afford nor abandon. The Gothic towers, he added, were romantic gestures toward a medieval past that had never existed, at least not in the form he imagined. The transformation Edward Bulwer Lytton imposed on Knebworth in the 1840s was radical. The Tudor brick was hidden or demolished. Stucco and stone cladding created the illusion of medieval permanence. Turrets, parapets, and pointed arches turned a practical manor house into a Gothic fantasy. This was theatre. Victorian England was obsessed with the medieval, with chivalry, romance, castles, and knights. The Gothic revival movement swept through architecture, literature, and design. It was a reaction against industrialization, a nostalgic retreat into an imagined past that felt more authentic, more English, more spiritually whole than the smoke and factories of the present. But the irony was brutal. Creating this medieval fantasy required cutting-edge Victorian industry. Stucco had to be mixed and applied by skilled plasterers. Ornamental stonework demanded masons trained in historical techniques. The new interior's oak paneling, stained glass, heraldic ceilings required workshops, suppliers, and craftsmen whose labor was anything but romantic. The house was an industrial product dressed up as a relic, and it cost a fortune. Edward borrowed heavily. The estate's income, primarily from agricultural rents, barely covered interest payments. The tenants who worked the land lived in cottages that lacked running water while the manor house sprouted gargoyles. The architect Edward hired was Henry Edward Kendall Jr., though Edward himself directed much of the design. He sketched ideas, referenced medieval manuscripts, and demanded details that evoked Arthurian legend. The exterior gained crenellated parapets, Gothic windows with pointed arches, decorative stonework that suggested defensive fortifications. None of it was functional. The crenellations couldn't hold arches. The stone facing carried no structural load. It was pure decoration, expensive and fragile. Inside, the transformation was equally theatrical. The Great Hall received a new hammerbeam ceiling carved with heraldic symbols, some real, some invented. Stained glass windows depicted scenes from literature and history. Fireplaces were enlarged and surrounded with Gothic stonework. Corridors were darkened with oak paneling. The effect was deliberately medieval, though no medieval house had ever looked quite like this. The construction disrupted the household for years. Dust filled every room. Scaffolding blocked windows. Noise echoed through corridors. The family lived around the work, retreating to undisturbed wings while builders tore apart and rebuilt others. Servants navigated the chaos, hauling coal past piles of stone, serving meals amid the clatter of hammers. Edward justified the expense as cultural preservation, arguing that he was rescuing English architectural heritage. In reality, he was inventing it. The medieval past he romanticized had been far messier, more brutal, and less aesthetically coherent. The Gothic revival created a sanitized version, stripping away discomfort while keeping the visual drama. The bills kept arriving. Plasterers, stonemasons, carpenters, glaziers all demanded payment. Edward negotiated delays, borrowed more, and kept building. The house had to be finished. It had to be perfect. His literary reputation, his social standing, his entire self-image demanded it. By the late Victorian era, Knebworth required a staff of at least 40 people to function. The exact number fluctuated, but the hierarchy was rigid. At the top sat the butler and housekeeper, managing male and female staff, respectively. Below them came footmen, valets, ladies' maids, cooks, kitchen maids, scullery maids, housemaids, laundresses, gardeners, grooms, and stable hands. Each role had defined duties. Housemaids rose before dawn to light fires in the principal rooms, so the family woke to warmth. They cleaned grates, hauled coal, swept floors, polished brass, and changed linens. Footmen served meals, answered bells, and maintained the public face of the household. Kitchen staff worked in basement spaces that were hot, dim, and relentless. Laundresses wrestled mountains of sheets and clothing in conditions that ruined hands and backs. The wages were modest. A scullery maid might earn £10 a year plus room and board. A butler could command £60. The gap between top and bottom was significant, but even the butler's income was a fraction of what the family spent annually on wine or clothing. The servant quarters were functional, not comfortable. Small rooms, narrow staircases, limited heating. Staff ate separately after the family finished. They used different entrances. Their presence was meant to be invisible unless summoned. The work was physically brutal. Housemaids carried coal scuttles up multiple flights of stairs, sometimes 20 or 30 times a day in winter. Laundresses stood for hours over steaming tubs, scrubbing linens with lye soap that burned skin. Kitchen maids rose at 5 in the morning to start the range and often didn't finish until 10 at night after cleaning up from dinner service. Injuries were common and rarely compensated. Burns from stoves and hot water, cuts from knives and broken glass, falls on wet stone floors, chronic back problems from hauling heavy loads. Servants who couldn't work were dismissed. There was no workers' compensation, no sick leave, no safety regulations. If you were hurt badly enough that you couldn't perform your duties, you were let go and replaced. The butler at Knebworth held real power over the staff below him. He decided who was hired, who received favorable assignments, who was reported to the family for infractions. This authority could be used fairly or abused. Some butlers became petty tyrants, enforcing arbitrary rules and playing favorites. Others managed with a degree of fairness, understanding that a smoothly running household required cooperation, not just fear. Social mobility within service was extremely limited. A scullery maid might, after years, become a kitchen maid or housemaid. A footman might advance to under butler. But these promotions were rare and depended on vacancies above. Most servants stayed in roughly the same position for decades, earning modest increases but never escaping the basic hierarchy. The family rarely saw this machinery. They rang bells, food appeared, fires burned, rooms stayed clean. The mechanism that produced these results remained hidden by design. The early 20th century brought a slow, creeping crisis. Agricultural rents, the foundation of a state income for centuries, were falling. Cheap grain from America and the empire undercut British farms. Tenants struggled. Some left. Fields went unplanted. Revenue dropped. At the same time, expectations remained high. The Edwardian era was the last gasp of aristocratic display before the world wars shattered everything. House parties still happened. Shooting parties. Guests arriving with servants in tow. Meals that required a small army to prepare and serve. The machinery of upper-class life ground on, but the fuel was running out. Repairs were deferred. Roofs leaked, stonework crumbled, heating systems already inadequate broke down and weren't fixed. The house was decaying, slowly but visibly, while the family maintained appearances. Then came August 1914. The declaration of war changed everything. Young men from the estate and the village enlisted. Some never came back. The social order that had seemed permanent revealed its fragility. After the war, nothing would be the same. The second Earl of Lytton, who inherited in 1891, watched the estate's finances deteriorate year by year. Agricultural depression was the primary culprit. British farming had been in decline since the 1870s when American wheat flooded European markets. Tenant farmers who had paid reliable rents for generations now struggled to pay at all. Some negotiated reductions. Others simply left, abandoning leases and leaving fields fallow. The Earl tried to diversify. Timber was harvested and sold. Parts of the estate were leased for hunting rights. Some land was sold outright, though this was seen as a last resort, a betrayal of ancestral trust. But these measures only slowed the decline. They didn't reverse it. The house itself was showing age. The Victorian Gothic additions, built quickly and decoratively rather than structurally, were already failing. Stucco cracked and fell away in chunks. The ornamental stonework weathered badly, details softening and eroding. The elaborate roof, with its multiple levels and Gothic peaks, leaked persistently. Buckets appeared in hallways during storms, catching drips that stained ceilings and damaged plasterwork. Heating remained a nightmare. Knebworth had never been properly insulated. The Gothic alterations focused on appearance, ignored thermal efficiency. In winter, even with fires blazing in every principal room, the house was bitterly cold. Corridors froze. Guest bedrooms were uninhabitable without warming pans. Staff suffered worst of all, relegated to unheated attic rooms where ice formed on the inside of windows. The staff itself was shrinking. As older servants retired or died, they weren't always replaced. The remaining workers absorbed additional duties. A housemaid who had once cleaned 6 rooms now cleaned 10. A gardener who had tended formal beds now tried to maintain entire sections of the grounds alone. Standards slipped. The house was still grand, but the cracks were beginning to show. The blow that nearly killed Knebworth wasn't a bomb or a fire. It was tax law. In 1894, Britain introduced Estate Duty A, tax on inherited wealth. The rate started low but climbed steadily. By the mid-20th century, death duties could claim up to 80% of an estate's value. For families like the Lyttons, whose wealth was tied up in land and buildings, this was catastrophic. When the second Earl of Lytton died in 1947, his son faced a bill in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. The estate didn't have liquid assets. The choice was brutal. Sell land, sell art, or sell the house itself. Land went first. Farms that had been part of the estate for centuries were auctioned. Tenant families who had worked the same fields for generations watched ownership change hands. Income shrank further. The house, already struggling, lost its economic foundation. Art and furnishings followed. Paintings, furniture, rare books pieces accumulated over centuries were valued, catalogued, and sold. Some went to museums, some went to dealers. The house began to hollow out. But even with sales, the gap remained. The tax system was designed for an era when aristocratic wealth was assumed to be infinite. In reality, most estates were running on fumes. Knebworth survived only because the family kept selling pieces of itself. The process was devastating and humiliating. Auctioneers arrived to appraise furniture that had been in the family for generations. Each piece was tagged, photographed, and assigned a value. Paintings were taken down from walls, leaving pale rectangles on faded wallpaper. Library shelves were emptied, rare first editions packed into crates and hauled away. The house was being dismantled from the inside. Some items went to national museums, which offered a small consolation. At least they would be preserved and publicly accessible. But much went to private collectors or dealers who simply resold for profit. Family heirlooms, objects with stories and histories, became commodities circulating through the art market with no memory of their origins. The psychological toll was immense. The third Earl, a career diplomat who had served as Viceroy of India, found himself presiding over the dissolution of his inheritance. He had not been profligate. He had not gambled away the fortune. He had simply inherited at the wrong historical moment, when the British state decided that aristocratic wealth would no longer be protected. The broader political context was clear. Post-war Britain was building a welfare state, funding the National Health Service, expanding education, constructing social housing. The money had to come from somewhere. Taxing inherited estates was politically popular and economically rational. The aristocracy had enjoyed centuries of untaxed accumulation. Now the bill was due. But knowing the political logic didn't make the personal reality easier. The Earl watched his ancestral home emptied piece by piece, powerless to stop it. The decision to open Knebworth to the public was not made lightly. For centuries, the house had been private, family, closed. The idea of strangers walking through the rooms, staring at furniture, touching walls, felt like violation. But by the 1950s, there was no choice. The bills had to be paid. The roof had to be repaired. Staff had to be employed, even if far fewer than before. Tourism offered a lifeline. The model was already established. Other estates, Chatsworth, Blenheim, Longleat, had opened and found that the British public would pay to see how the other half lived. There was curiosity, nostalgia, a desire to touch history. Knebworth began cautiously. Guided tours on select days. Admission fees were modest. Visitor facilities were minimal, but people came. They walked through the staterooms, examined the Victorian Gothic decor, and bought postcards and tea in the gardens. The revenue was small, but steady. More importantly, it created a new identity. Knebworth was no longer just a family home. It was a heritage site, a cultural asset. That shift, subtle but profound, would shape everything that followed. The first visitors arrived tentatively, unsure what to expect. They queued outside, purchased tickets, and entered in small groups led by guides. The tours followed a set route through the principal rooms: the Great Hall, the library, the state drawing room, the banqueting hall. Ropes kept visitors at a safe distance from furniture and artwork. Photography was forbidden. The guides were often local volunteers, knowledgeable about the house's history and trained to answer questions without revealing family financial troubles. The narrative they presented was carefully curated: architectural significance, historical associations, famous visitors, anecdotes about Edward Bulwer Lytton's literary career. What they didn't mention was the desperate economic situation that had forced the doors open. Visitor feedback was mixed. Some found the experience thrilling, a rare glimpse into aristocratic life. Others felt uncomfortable, aware that they were walking through someone's home, however grand. A few visitors were critical, seeing the house as a symbol of inequality, wealth extracted from tenant labor and now monetized through tourism. The family adjusted slowly. Initially, the Earl and his family retreated entirely during visiting hours, unwilling to be observed like zoo animals. Over time, they carved out private spaces and learned to coexist with the public areas. Some rooms were permanently closed to tours, maintaining a boundary between heritage site and lived-in home. The physical impact on the house was immediate. Foot traffic wore carpets and wooden floors. Body heat and breath altered humidity levels, threatening artwork and fabrics. Security became a concern. Valuable objects in accessible rooms required monitoring. Additional staff were hired: ticket sellers, guides, maintenance workers to clean after visitors left. But the income was real. Ticket sales covered immediate expenses and funded small repairs. The house stabilized financially for the first time in decades. Tourism was working. The idea came from a promoter, not the family. Knebworth had space-rolling lawns, fields that could hold tens of thousands. The location was accessible but not urban, and the family needed money. The first major rock festival at Knebworth happened in July 1974. The Allman Brothers headlined. Van Morrison, the Doobie Brothers, and others filled the bill. Attendance estimates vary, but at least 120,000 people descended on the estate over 3 days. It was chaos. Campfires scorched the grass. Portable toilets overflowed. The noise was relentless. Locals complained. The police were overwhelmed. The family watched from the windows as their ancestral grounds became a temporary city of tents, speakers, and intoxicated strangers. But it worked. The festival made money. More importantly, it put Knebworth on the map for a new generation. The house wasn't just a relic. It was a venue, a brand, a place where history and contemporary culture collided. More festivals followed. Led Zeppelin in 1979, Queen in 1986, Oasis in 1996. Each event brought logistical nightmares: insurance, security, cleanup, and each one generated revenue that kept the estate afloat. The preparation for the 1974 festival was frantic. Contracts had to be negotiated, licensing obtained, temporary infrastructure installed: stages, fencing, power supplies, water sources, medical tents, security posts. The local council was skeptical, worried about noise, traffic, and disorder. Residents were divided. Some saw economic opportunity. Others feared disruption. When the crowds arrived, the scale became clear. Thousands of vehicles clogged nearby roads. The estate's normal entrance was overwhelmed. Temporary gates were opened in fences. People streamed across fields that had once been carefully maintained parkland. Tents sprouted everywhere. Cooking fires sent smoke into the air. The smell of cannabis drifted toward the house. The music was astonishingly loud. The Allman Brothers sound system, state-of-the-art for 1974, projected across the entire estate. Inside the house, windows rattled. Conversations were impossible. The family, who had retreated to private wings, could still hear every note. The aftermath was sobering. The lawns were destroyed, churned to mud by tens of thousands of feet. Trash was everywhere. Bottles, cans, food wrappers, abandoned tents and sleeping bags. The cleanup took weeks. Turf had to be relaid, fences repaired, portable toilets removed, and the ground they'd sat on sanitized. But the financial results were undeniable. The festival generated more income in one weekend than a full year of house tours. The promotional value was equally significant. Knebworth was now associated with legendary rock performances, attracting a younger demographic who would never have visited a stately home otherwise. The decision to continue hosting festivals was made carefully. The disruption was real, but the revenue was essential. Knebworth had found a new identity, aristocratic heritage site by day, rock venue by night. Knebworth's Gothic architecture made it irresistible to filmmakers. The turrets, the stonework, the sense of age and mystery it photographed beautifully. And the family, by now practiced in monetizing the estate, recognized another revenue stream. The house has appeared in dozens of films and television shows. Batman The King's Speech filmed scenes there. Countless period dramas borrowed its rooms for aristocratic interiors. Each production paid location fees, provided employment for local crews, and reinforced Knebworth's cultural visibility. But there was a cost. Film crews are invasive. Lights scar ceilings. Equipment scrapes floors. Cables snake through hallways. Rooms are dressed, then stripped. The house becomes a tool, not a home. The family accepted this. By the late 20th century, Knebworth was a business. Sentiment had to yield to survival. If the house could be a backdrop for Batman or a stand-in for a royal residence, so be it. The first major film shoot at Knebworth occurred in the 1980s. The production company approached the estate, offered a substantial location fee, and promised minimal disruption. The reality was more complex. Film crews arrived with trucks full of equipment. Cameras, lights, rigging, generators, catering vans, costume trailers, portable offices. The house had to be prepared. Furniture was moved or covered. Floors were protected with plywood and carpets. Artwork was removed from walls to prevent damage. Rooms were repainted if the production required specific colors. The transformation was disorienting, watching ancestral spaces turned into stage sets. Filming itself was intense. Crews worked long hours, sometimes through the night. Lights blazed in rooms that had been dark for decades. Actors in period costume wandered through hallways. Directors shouted instructions. The noise and activity were constant. The family negotiated strict terms. Certain rooms were off limits, preserved as private family space. Filming schedules had to accommodate public tours. Knebworth couldn't shut down tourism entirely. Damage deposits ensured repairs would be funded if equipment caused harm. The financial benefits were significant. A single week of filming could generate more revenue than months of ticket sales. Productions also covered insurance, security, and sometimes even provided catering for estate staff. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. Filmmakers got atmospheric locations. The estate got desperately needed income. But there were tensions. Some family members found the invasions distressing, watching strangers treat their home as a prop. Others were pragmatic, understanding that film revenue kept the roof repaired and the heating system running. The cultural impact was notable. Millions of people saw Knebworth on screen without knowing it was Knebworth. The house became a cinematic shorthand for Gothic romance, aristocratic decay, or historical grandeur. Its architecture entered popular consciousness, shaping how audiences imagined England's past. The estate embraced this. Marketing materials highlighted film appearances. Tours mentioned which movies had been shot where. Knebworth's identity as a film location became part of its brand. Maintaining a building like Knebworth is never finished. Stone erodes, wood rots, lead roofs corrode. Every decade demands intervention. But preservation raises questions that have no easy answers. Do you restore the house to its Tudor origins, its Victorian Gothic reinvention, its current hybrid state? Each choice erases something. Each choice privileges one era over another. Authenticity is a slippery concept. Almost nothing at Knebworth is original in the sense of untouched. Every generation has rebuilt, added, subtracted. The house is a record of change, not permanence. And then there's function. A house frozen as a museum dies. It becomes a stage set, visited but not lived in. The Lytton family still resides at Knebworth, occupying private apartments while the staterooms host tourists. That tension between home and heritage site shapes every decision. Repairs must meet modern building codes. Fire safety, accessibility, energy efficiency, these aren't optional, but they often clash with historical fabric. The result is compromise, always compromise. When the roof required major work in the 1990s, the estate faced a classic dilemma. The existing roof was a Victorian installation, copper and slate, already a replacement for earlier roofing. Should repairs match Victorian materials and methods, or should modern materials more durable, more weatherproof be used even if they altered the historical character? The decision required consultations with heritage bodies, structural engineers, and conservationists. The compromise: use traditional materials on visible surfaces, modern weatherproofing beneath. The roof would look historically appropriate but perform to contemporary standards. It was expensive, technically complex, and satisfied no one completely. Interior preservation presented different challenges. The Victorian Gothic interiors were themselves overlays on earlier structures. Preserving them meant accepting Edward Bulwer-Lytton's fantasy as legitimate history. But stripping them away to reveal Tudor fabric would destroy significant 19th century craftsmanship. The solution: preserve what exists, document what lies beneath, and accept that Knebworth is inherently hybrid. Fire safety upgrades were particularly fraught. Modern regulations require sprinkler systems, fire doors, and alarm systems. Installing these in a historic building without destroying decorative plasterwork, wood paneling, and painted ceilings is nearly impossible. Compromises were negotiated: discrete sprinkler heads in less ornate areas, fire doors designed to match historical joinery, alarm systems hidden in moldings. Accessibility was equally complicated. Modern visitors expect elevators, ramps, accessible toilets. But Knebworth was built with stairs, narrow doorways, and no consideration for mobility limitations. Adding accessibility features required structural alterations. Ramps installed in gardens, platform lifts discreetly placed in service areas, accessible routes mapped through the house that avoided the most fragile spaces. Energy efficiency became urgent as heating costs soared. The house was fundamentally inefficient: high ceilings, single-pane windows, minimal insulation. Full efficiency would require double glazing, wall insulation, modern HVAC systems, all incompatible with historic fabric. The compromise: improve insulation in hidden areas, upgrade boilers, install secondary glazing that mimicked historical windows while improving thermal performance. Each decision balanced preservation against practicality, history against function. There were no perfect answers. The brutal arithmetic of running Knebworth is rarely discussed publicly, but the numbers tell the story. Annual operating costs run into the hundreds of thousands of pounds. Staffing groundskeepers, tour guides, administrators, maintenance crews is the largest expense. Utilities come next. Heating a building this size in a British winter is staggering. Insurance is massive. Then come repairs, which never stop. Revenue comes from multiple sources: ticket sales from house tours and garden visits, event bookings, weddings, corporate functions, festivals, film location fees, retail, the gift shop, the cafe. Licensing: the Knebworth brand appears on products. Even with diversification, the margins are thin. A bad year, poor weather, a cancelled festival, a major repair can wipe out surpluses. There's no safety net. The estate operates on a knife edge. The Lytton family no longer lives off inherited wealth. They work. Managing Knebworth is a full-time occupation, balancing preservation with profit, heritage with commerce, the past with the present. The financial breakdown is revealing. Staffing costs typically consume 40 to 50% of annual revenue. The estate employs year-round staff for administration, maintenance, and security, supplemented by seasonal workers during peak tourist season. Wages are competitive but not lavish. Many positions require specialized skills: conservation, horticulture, historical interpretation that command market rates. Utilities are punishing. Heating alone can cost £100,000 annually. The house is fundamentally inefficient, and running heat through winter months drains resources constantly. Electricity for lighting, security systems, and visitor facilities adds tens of thousands more. Water, sewage, telecommunications all scale to the building's size. Insurance premiums reflect the property's value and vulnerability. The house contains irreplaceable historic fabric, valuable artwork, and furnishings. Public liability insurance covers the million-plus visitors annually. Event insurance covers festivals and weddings. The combined premiums are substantial, often exceeding £50,000 per year. Maintenance is relentless and unpredictable. Routine work, gutter cleaning, repainting, gardening is scheduled and budgeted. Emergency repairs, storm damage, burst pipes, electrical failures are not. A single severe weather event can necessitate tens of thousands of pounds in immediate work. The estate maintains a repair reserve, but it's perpetually inadequate. Revenue diversification is essential but complex. House tours generate steady baseline income but are weather-dependent and seasonal. Summer brings crowds, winter brings empty rooms. Events, weddings, corporate functions provide higher per-event revenue but require intensive management and carry reputational risks if poorly executed. Film shoots are lucrative but sporadic and disruptive. The rock festivals, while controversial, are financially critical. A single major concert can generate profit equivalent to an entire year of house tours. But they're also risky. Bad weather, low ticket sales, or production problems can turn profit into loss. The estate has learned to negotiate carefully, requiring deposits, limiting liability, and building contingencies into contracts. Retail and catering offer smaller but consistent revenue. The gift shop sells branded merchandise, local crafts, and historical books. The cafe serves visitors year-round. Profit margins are modest, but they contribute to overall viability. Knebworth has survived 5 centuries, but survival has never been free. The Tudor masons who laid the first stones are nameless. The Victorian labourers who built Edward's Gothic fantasy were paid wages that barely covered subsistence. The servants who scrubbed floors and hauled coal lived lives that history has largely erased. The tenant farmers who worked the land for generations lost their livelihoods when death duties forced sales. The house remembers the Lyttons. Portraits line the walls. Family stories fill the guidebooks, but the people who built it, maintained it, and sacrificed for it, they're ghosts. This isn't unique to Knebworth. Every grand house carries this weight. Every estate runs on a foundation of invisible labor. The beauty is real. The achievement is real. But so is the cost, and the cost was borne by people whose names we'll never know. The rock festivals and film shoots are just the latest chapter. The compromise continues. The house stands, but only because each generation has been willing to reinvent it, to strip away pieces, to sell what had to be sold. The question now is whether this model can last. Can tourism and events sustain a building this large indefinitely? What happens when the novelty fades? When the next generation decides the burden is too great? Knebworth has survived longer than almost anyone predicted. But survival is not the same as security. The house still stands. For now, the estate's archives contain occasional glimpses of the forgotten. A ledger from 1847 lists the names of workers employed during Edward's Gothic reconstruction: Thomas Webb, stonemason James Parker, plasterer William Smith, carpenter. Their wages are recorded precisely. Webb earned 3 shillings per day, Parker 2 and 6pence, Smith 2 shillings. These amounts, converted, represent subsistence wages, enough to survive, not enough to save. A housekeeper's diary from 1892 mentions a scullery maid named Mary who injured her hand badly in the kitchen. She was given 2 weeks to recover, unpaid, then dismissed when the hand didn't heal properly. She was 17. What happened to her after dismissal? The record is silent. The tenant farmers fared little better. When the estate sold land in the 1950s to pay death duties, families who had worked the same fields for 3 or 4 generations suddenly had new landlords. Some were evicted to make way for more profitable uses. Others faced rent increases they couldn't afford. A few purchased their holdings, but most lacked capital. They scattered, absorbed into towns, their names surviving only on fading parish records. The current estate employs historians to research and document this labor history. It's a small gesture toward honesty. Tours now mention servants and workers, though briefly. The stories remain partial, constrained by what records survived and by the difficulty of narrating exploitation while celebrating architectural achievement. The tension is unresolvable. Knebworth is beautiful. Knebworth cost lives.